Let's start then. This is me with my twin brother and my little brother. As a child, I was very obedient. My mom often said that my younger brother, as you can see in the middle, he was much more to handle than both of us twins together. And I had the fortune to grow up in a very loving family. Felt very safe. But when I grew older, I realized that the world wasn't as safe as my family, that weapons were produced that could actually destroy all life on Earth. So that actually led me to my first civil disobedience action, which is 15 years ago this summer actually. So here is a group when we met, and we planned an action at a nuclear weapons facility, where we broke in and we planted actually wine and fig trees as a symbolic gesture. And I was very nervous, as you can imagine, during this action and also before that. But I also felt a little bit silly. I mean, here we were, a small group, breaking into one of the largest factories of weapons in the world. I mean, wasn't it naive to think that we could make a difference? But since then, my faith in nonviolence has actually grown more and more during the years. And I hope to show you why that is during this presentation. And also, of course, we have a little time, but mainly I want you to get more interested and maybe do some research yourself after this in nonviolence. So for a long time, we humans have had two ways to deal with conflict, fight or flight. And that probably worked quite well on the savannah when we were chased by a lion. But in this modern world, it's not always the best way. So how do we solve conflicts? Well, fortunately, there is a third way called nonviolence, where you can stay active but make a difference when there is a conflict or an oppression. So what is nonviolence? Well, there are many definitions, but there is a Swedish professor called Stellan Windhagen, and he has made this simple definition beginning with without violence. And that is obvious for most, right? You can't have violence when you talk about nonviolence. But says this professor, it's not enough. You also have to have against violence. So something that moves against this violence or oppression or injustice. And that together makes nonviolence. So just to be clear, taking a walk in the park, it's not nonviolence because it doesn't have this element of resistance against nonviolence. It's just a walk in the park. So with other words, you can say that nonviolence is a struggle against violence without the use of violence. The claim book, This is an Uprising, written by Mark and Paul Engler. There they describe how successful nonviolence has been during the last couple of decades. But I also write that it's quite poorly understood, this concept of nonviolence and the strategies. It's a great book where you can read more the strategy behind the nonviolence thinking. And I would like to mention 4 aspects of nonviolence to begin with that I think are of big importance. And that is, firstly, the means and ends go together. We live in a world where there is so much suffering against animals. and of course against people as well. But for me, if we want to struggle against it violence, it doesn't make sense to then use violence ourselves. If we want to create a non-violent world, a world where there's less suffering, then I don't want to inflict that suffering on anyone else. And also, when it comes to how the state or other power entities act, they are more used to violent opposition, actually. It's much harder for them to control creative non-violent campaigns, I would say. Because as you see, they have the equipment to handle violence. The means may be likened to a seed and to a tree. So this is something that Gandhi said. Gandhi also being one of the most famous people for using non-violence and writing about non-violence. So in his mind, and also in mine, you can't really separate the two. They go together. If you want to have a world with peace and non-violence, that's the way to go to create it as well. We have in the world many guerrilla armies or movements that are struggling for a just cause, really worthwhile cause to get democracy or freedom. But the problem is that if they succeed in winning over the oppressor, many times they can't get away from the violence. If they've used violence, they will perpetrate that when they are in power themselves. And we have seen country after country really suffering from this, unfortunately. And I think the same kind of mechanisms could be in every movement. So you are affected if you use violence in a negative way. Another thing that speaks for non-violence is that research shows that non-violent movements tend to attract more people. So the chances of creating a big movement or a mass movement is greater if you go for non-violence. And the thing is also important to realize or think about is that you don't have to be a saint or something like that to use non-violence. Would I have killed Hitler if I would have the chance before he started the Second World War? Is there sometimes justification for violence? These are hard questions, and we can have different opinions on that, and that's okay. The thing is, when you do a non-violent action together, it's important that you agree on that very action when you're doing it, and that can be enough. But one should also realize that even if everyone in a movement or in an action uses non-violence could be perfectly, you can be met by violence, obviously, especially if you're effective in your struggle. That can be the case. And that's something that we will connect to when it comes to the second aspect of non-violence, which is non-violence exposes the violence. So the civil rights movement in the US was very active in the 50s and 60s, and especially the turning point was the Birmingham campaign in 1963. And Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders got arrested for using illegal methods at that time, like marches or boycotts. And there was 8 pastors that wrote an article in a newspaper, and this newspaper was handed in to Martin Luther King when he was sitting in his jail cell. And they criticized King and others for using these confrontative methods like marches and sit-ins and boycotts. Why don't you go for dialogue, they asked. And then Martin Luther King, he began writing his answer on small pieces of newspaper that had been smuggled into him, and which he managed to get out. And that became known as the the letter from the Birmingham jail. And there he said this: "We who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with." There was another important incident in the animal rights movement in 1961. It was white and black students that went with buses down to the deep south in the US to struggle against the segregation they had. And they were stopped in Alabama by a mob of white people. And they, as you can see here, threw in a bomb which made the bus explode into fire, and they tried to prevent them of getting out. Most got out, but there were some that didn't make it. And this was news all over the US, but also in the world. And I think was a turning point in the civil rights movement as well. And of course, this struggle doesn't end. Even today, people like George Floyd are getting killed. So it's by no means that we have succeeded in this struggle. It still keeps on. But I still would say that these non-violent protests in the 60s made a remarkable move forward. But it doesn't mean that the struggle stops there, of course. Now coming to the animal rights issue, 47%, what's that? That is actually the number of percent of the American population that supports a ban on slaughterhouses. Quite amazing numbers. And of course, that's good news. In that, many are already on our side. The bad news is, of course, that when they go to the supermarket or the restaurant, they don't follow this idea because they themselves take part in the slaughter indirectly. But that's something to build on. And I think these actions we do can shine a light on the violence that actually they are a part of. And maybe we can try to get the compassion that they actually show by saying that they should close all slaughterhouses. How about violence in the animal rights movement? Well, to my knowledge, it's quite uncommon, unfortunately. But it does happen. Here is my friend Max, and 2 years ago he went into the Swedish forest to try to non-violently stop hunts. And his car got rounded up by hunters, and they put lighter fluids around the car and tried to put it on fire. And they actually blocked the doors of the car so they wouldn't get out. Of course, the activists panicked and they came out eventually and got beaten up by the hunters. Terrible incident. But luckily, Max, who you can see on the left here in the picture, he didn't give up. So last year he was a part of the chicken inspection. And this was a group where some of us went into slaughterhouses here in the chicken slaughterhouse, and also later the same year, last year, into a slaughterhouse of where they kill pigs and cows. And this is, of course, a way to expose the violence that is done to animals. And we don't create the tension or the violence, we just bring it in the open. where it can be seen and dealt with. We do that in the same way, or try, this is my thinking, that the same mechanism as in the civil rights movement. We document what is done to the animals, and we try to bring it out. So moving on with the 4 aspects. Number 3, political jujutsu. And jujutsu, it's a kind of a martial arts from Japan. And this specific method, it uses the strength of the opponent to make an attack on him. So the stronger and the bigger the opponent is, the more the force will go back to him. And the same can be used in nonviolence. So if we use nonviolence, there will be sometimes a violent response. And this can be, when people see that we are met with the violence, this can create a public response. So people can be more empathic to our cause. And maybe if they have been not deciding on the issue, they might be seen to be forced to morally to take a stand. And also it can create pressure on politicians. Maybe they will feel like they have to act because of this violence, and it can affect their credibility if they don't act, and also loss of votes, etc. In the best case scenario, of course. This is a very famous picture. It was also taken in, if I don't remember wrongly, in Birmingham in 1963. And this was published around the world as an example, a prime example of how peaceful people protesting for a just cause are met with violence, especially when it's young people like this one. And that affected the way the public looks on the issue of discrimination, or it did a lot. But for this to work, for this empathy to come out, it's important that we actually are nonviolent and we communicate nonviolence. Because if we use violence, then I think it's quite certain that people will not be empathic with us and support our cause. Most people will only think that we're troublemakers and no good for society. But it doesn't mean, of course, that everyone will agree with us if we are nonviolent. This is a picture of Bull Connors, and he was the police chief in Birmingham at the time of this Birmingham campaign that I mentioned before. And he thought that he had the public in his town with him in Birmingham. And that was probably right, because in the South, especially maybe in Birmingham, Alabama, racism was very high. So locally, he might have the support of the majority. But when they saw these powerful hoses that you can see, and also police dogs being used against these nonviolent activists, the public in the north of the country and also the White House, they thought this was incredible, violent and wrong way to try to handle the situation. So that also created a momentum for the campaign. And I think this can be the same when we struggle for animal rights. Some might think that, oh, you are to blame yourself if you go into slaughterhouses, or if you blockade a slaughterhouse or a farm or something like that. I don't support that at all. But then there could be others that maybe are unsure where to stand on the issue, that see that, okay, they're just standing up for these innocent animals, and they are met with repression, like sometimes violence, but also legal repercussions. And I know for a fact that at least one person has been changed with this, and it's not often you hear about how that affects people, but sometimes it does. And here is an example in Swedish, as you can see, and this is a list with comments that we got after the Swedish animal rights group Empty Cages, Tomma burar, did slaughterhouse blockade. So it says number 1, die. Number 2, please can someone just drive them over. 3, run over them, these fucking idiots. And so it goes on and goes on, and no less than 800 comments. And obviously these people are not very supportive to our actions, to say the least. But there were many that read these comments, and I think felt more support for us after that. Because I think at least the majority think that, okay, they were blockading a slaughterhouse for less than an hour, but for the animals, is it the right response to kill them for that? No, I think most people think that's excessive. So yeah, and you should think that, okay, you do an action, but you should realize this are not going to change maybe the majority, but it might be enough to change those that are on the fence. So maybe you are neutral on the issue, and maybe an action or a couple of actions can switch them to become supporters. And another action could switch supporters to become activists. And that can be a turning point. That could be like crucial for the movement. These slight changes, but very important. But there are three ways to increase support and also to reduce this hate. I mean, support from the public. And these are my suggestions, that if we use this very aggressive language, like this man often does, we are not really getting the empathy from the public, or at least it's not as likely as if we use more non-violent language. And also, if we direct our criticism, and we should direct it when we are in opposition to animal oppression, we should aim at the companies or the system itself that that makes this happen. So here is Scan, for example, a very big Swedish brand a company with lots of slaughterhouses in Sweden. So we can direct this towards them instead of individual workers or consumers. Why is that? It's because then they who actually work with these companies and also consume animal products, they have an easier way to join us, or at least agree with us if they don't feel attacked themselves. Yeah, I think that's a strategic choice which we will gain more with. And also what we should do is to show these can be symbolic gestures that we are non-violent. So it could be with words, or here, like here with a flower, or something to really show the difference between the state, which can use violence, and also the animal industry that uses violence against animals, but we who are for a non-violent change to want to reduce violence. So we can think about different ways, of course, how to show this. Then there is the issue of sacrifice that can influence people. So it could be a smaller thing, like standing in a very cold Swedish winter. Here, like here at the vigil outside of the slaughterhouse in Uppsala, with the Uppsala Animal Save. Or it could be something bigger, like taking the risk of facing prison time, or maybe losing your job, or something very substantial like that. Why does that have any influence? Well, maybe there are some that think, if she's risking all that, it might be something that I also should care about. Because people evaluate us and our actions, of course, on how much we're willing to put on the line. So that's why I think, potentially at least, that can have an effect. So 4 aspects, and we are at the 4th one, the act and the actor. And this is a thinking in nonviolence theory, that we are complex humans. Humans are complex. We have both good and bad within us. So yeah, I reject the thinking that some are 100% bad or 100% good. I don't think it really exists. And what we do with this in nonviolence is that we separate between behavior and who you are. So we can be 100% against behavior, like slaughtering animals, for instance, or eating meat. And we should say that if the moment is right, that we're opposed to that. But it doesn't mean that we have to hate the person behind it. It can be difficult, but I think it's possible to do this separation between behavior and person. So here's an example of that. It was in the 1980s. Peace movement against nuclear military bases, and they did lots of different direct action in this campaign, but they also invited the soldiers from this base to dinner, and to show that even though they had different opinions, which they firmly hold on to during the whole campaign, and they didn't stop doing these actions, but they said, we can continue these actions, we don't have to agree, but we can have a meal together as people, to show this separation between people and opinions and political decisions. This is a philosopher famous in Norway. His name is Arne Næss. He was at environmental action and was taken away by the police, and while they were carrying him away, he gave the police advice on how to hold him effectively so they wouldn't strain their backs. Also an example of a non-violent thinking. Another reason why not to have hateful messages to people and that are opposed to what we are thinking is that, well, if they don't feel attacked by us, if they feel that they are not our enemy and we are not their enemy, then actually the switch could be made easier. So they could join us in the best case scenario. For instance, whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, that goes from being one of the ones working in an industry that is bad to someone that actually supports the other side. And this can be seen in many struggles, like for instance, where they have struggled for democracy in Central or Eastern European countries, where they have said to the soldiers, we are your brothers, and they have actually sometimes gone over to the other side. So these were the 4 aspects of nonviolence, and now I thought we could spend a few minutes of talking about methods. And this man, Gene Sharp, he began in the 1970s to list different nonviolent methods that he had seen in different political struggles. And he came up with a list of 198 methods of nonviolent action. And of course, this was in the 70s, so many more actions have been added since then. But this list you can find easily on the web later with all the methods, and he wrote lots of books about them as well. And he took all these methods and he put them into 3 categories: protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, and intervention. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but animal rights movement as a whole has focused the most on non-cooperation, and more specifically to not eat meat, or to try to make people go vegan, of course. And of course, the thinking behind this makes sense to me in many ways, that if people don't eat animal products, if we succeed of everyone going vegan, then we won't have any animal exploitation. But there is also a problem, I think, with that, because if we are so focused on not to do, maybe we lose the focus on what you can do. So I'm wondering if we can get, I mean, we have many millions of vegans around the world today. If we can get just a small percentage of those to become activists, to do something, other things like, we talked about, then I think the movement would really grow and have a much bigger impact. This first category of protest and persuasion is popular in every movement, I would say, and also in the animal rights movement. So here is a march in Sweden, for instance. And of course, it's many other kind of methods in this category of everything from writing letters to the editor to having signs or showing video at squares and streets in the cities. We have a bit less of this method or category of interventions. And the intervention could be open rescues, freeing animals from farms and putting them in loving homes. It could be blockades, as we talked about, but also like here with Meet the Victims, where they like occupation of a farm for some limited time, and also documenting. Of course, Direct Action Everywhere do also open rescues, but also these what do you call them again? Where you go into stores. Disruptions, of course. That's a kind of intervention as well, I would say. So why are there fewer of these kind of actions than protest or boycotts? Well, I think it's quite clear that these kind of interventions, they are more risky, and it's not as attractive if you have a bigger risk for most people. So there are many, but I see there are more and more of these actions coming in the world. I mean, there has been a huge change just the last 5-10 years, especially I think the last 5 years, in having more of these kind of actions. One example was from last year, where in Australia they had coordinated lots of different slaughterhouse blockades, and also other kinds of protests like this one at the square, I think. This is the front page of New York Times. So they got some really good media coverage for it. I wonder how many here don't like making people angry or yeah, or being like in a conflict. I would certainly be one of them. And this is also something that maybe hinders us to do these kind of interventions that we don't like when people are getting upset. But I think if we support one another when it's tough, we can challenge ourselves to do these things that can, yeah, it demands a bit more of us, and it can be uncomfortable, but I think in the long run we will gain from it as persons, but as also as a movement. So we have, Gene Sharp had these three categories as I mentioned, but I want to mention a fourth one that Sharp didn't have, but I think is essential in the struggle for animal liberation, and that is the constructive program. And this is a term coined by Gandhi, and it's all about creating what we want to see tomorrow, but we create it already today. One example of this is sanctuaries, because here we have places where animals from the industry are coming, and instead of being tormented and then killed at a young age, they are treated as a person, as an individual with unique abilities and needs. This is Albert and Lena at Gotlands djurfristad, the sanctuary at Gotland in Sweden, the biggest one we have. Of course, in this constructive program, we want to offer good alternatives to animal products. And I think that's very important, and something also that has exploded in variety and quality the last couple of years, I would say, like Beyond Meat. And of course, it can be important to start new companies like this one, but also to promote these products and other products that makes it easier to have the transition from a meat-based society to a vegan society. Something that people have different opinions on, but I think can be a real game changer is clean meat or lab-produced meat. That is actually meat, but it doesn't come from an animal. We don't have it yet, but they are really putting resources into researching it. And if they succeed with this, I think it could make animal oppression obsolete. We don't have to have animals then. And if they can make it in a way that where no animals are suffering, that would be fantastic. But I think also that we need to keep on pressuring morally the world to go vegan. There should be a reason for why we should develop these kind of alternatives, whether it's from plants or clean meat, because people need to have a reason to make the shift. So we have talked about protest and persuasion, non-cooperation, intervention, and the constructive program. But some people are saying, oh, but I don't want to work with people. It's too much. I work for animals, not people. But the thing is that we won't get away with without working with people. And why is that? Well, we need people on our side, of course. We need to grow a bigger movement, but we also need the support from others, from politicians to company owners to consumers. And that means that we need to think about when I do an action, what kind of implications does this have? How do people think about this? And also, we need to think about how does it affect society? So how does it affect companies, government, parliament, etc.? That's really a responsibility we have as activists, I believe. Another thing I think is important is training. In a non-violence training, you can discuss strategies, you try out different methods. You can use role play like they're doing here. This was from a training in Copenhagen I facilitated with actually Direct Action Everywhere. And also trainings can be important to build community, to get to know each other, to work better together. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel very small and insignificant when I think about how big slaughterhouses and farms and the animal industry as a whole is. But then it's important, you can also feel, I at least feel is like sometimes that you're like a prophet in the desert. You have an important message, but no one is hearing it. No one wants to hear it. They want just to continue to eat their meat and go on with their usual way. But I think here it's important to think about that even though it's true that we have a majority against us at this moment, at least in behavior, if not in values, we can do a lot of change. And I'm hopeful of this because I see what has been accomplished in history. Before, no one would even think about that we would get bans the slave trade and having slaves, but that was done in the US. No one would have thought that women would get the right to vote, but they succeeded in doing that. And no one thought that a woman and woman would be able to marry, but that has changed very fast. And these are, today, of course, these are things that we take for granted, and these accomplishments are not to say that we have accomplished everything that needs to be done. And we can see it again when it comes to our skin of the color and how that affects how we're treated. But still, it makes me hopeful that if we continue to struggle with these issues and for animals, we can accomplish a lot. I see small signs of that also in the animal rights movement, like here in Linköping, where the slaughterhouse have put up these signs, lots of signs, new fences, everything to get rid of this local save group, where we have been a lot. Because even though we only document the animals before they go in with the slaughterhouse trucks, it seems like we're making a difference, at least because they don't want us there. It's bad PR for them, and hopefully in the end that will show also how the public views the slaughter of these poor animals. You can see in how companies are using commercials like Burger King. It says if you like chicken or if you like chickens. And of course that's a major difference, and this is the way they did PR for their plant-based burger. Non-violence, I believe, is effective, but we need to work hard to make this change happen, I believe. We know all that animals are suffering every day in great numbers. So my hope is that we will do our best to think about methods and think about how you and I myself can act in the best way for the animals in the long run. The environment activist McKibben, he said this: "Nonviolent protest movements may be the greatest invention in the 20th century. It's our biggest hope to confront what threatens our very existence." And I believe he's right. And also, if you look at, again, the environmental movement, I see a lot of hope in like Extinction Rebellion, which actually have succeeded in large part to create a big movement and radical movement with a lot of people using civil disobedience and other kind of actions. So who knows, maybe we'll get there with animal rights as well. And lastly, I want you to think back when you're older. I don't know your age now, but when you get to be a bit older, maybe in your 70s, 80s, you can, if that's in the future, you can look back and maybe your grandchildren or your siblings' grandchildren will ask you, I mean, how did you do it? How did you stop the slaughter? How did you make it into a vegan world? And then you can say, hopefully, that you were a part of that. You made it happen together, of course, with lots and lots of other people. That's my hope, at least. So with that, I thank you for listening so far, and I look forward to discuss this with you.